Good afternoon, everybody. Somewhat limited here today, but nevertheless, we are pleased and delighted to celebrate the Eucharist the second Sunday of Lent, the third week now of our Lent message series we've been calling Seriously God? Question and mark. Making sense of when life doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense that during this crazy time in the world, even today, we preach this particular message that we're hearing. And we brought up three principles to guide us through the series we introduced 2 weeks ago. The first principle is this: it makes sense that God doesn't always make sense. It makes sense that an all-powerful, all-knowing being wouldn't act as we act, and his ways wouldn't be our ways as human beings. It certainly just makes sense. But we can grow in understanding. The second principle we've said is this: we can grow to know God's thoughts and ways because He has revealed them to us in Jesus, in His Word. Our faith is a revelation, and we can come to know His thoughts and ways over time. The third principle that we've talked about is that we can't confuse life not making sense with God not making sense. There are many times in our life when life's not going to make sense. But as I've said, in the moment of a crisis, we shouldn't just cry out, "Why, God?" but instead profess faith that God is with us. That has a plan for you and me, and we can grow over time to understand. We'll come back to that point here shortly. Last week we talked about, if you were with us, when God says no. Certainly, God does say no to us from time to time. And as Jesus taught last week, three particular ways God might say no to you. He might say no when you put your needs over your need first and foremost for God. God might say no. He might say no, second of all, when we are going to make a choice that will compromise with evil. God will want to protect us. And third, God might say no when we're just giving in to the crowd. We're just giving in to vanity, the pressure of pleasing other people. That's really a temptation to skip the cross. And so God will say no to us when we have that temptation. Ultimately, God is not a God of no. He's a God of yes. Well, today we're going to look at another aspect of, when we might cry out, "Seriously, God?" And that's when we feel that God maybe has let us down. That God has even maybe abandoned us. He made promises to you. You had hopes and dreams in your life, and God didn't deliver. He wasn't there. In a moment of crisis, He wasn't there to fulfill those plans. And you have this sinking feeling that God's just absent. He's asleep. He's let. It's all the more appropriate that we talk about this topic on this when the COVID lockdowns first happened. Now we can all just reflect maybe a little bit on these past 2 years and start to ask the question, God, what are you doing in the world, and what are you doing in my life in these past years that I may come to understand and help to grow? Now, going back 2 years, our emotions were all over the place. People were just raised up suddenly as heroes, needing to be heroes, whether as parents or as teachers or medical professionals, suddenly on the front line. Other people maybe felt just cast aside, that their life was just ignored. They weren't important. Maybe it's because of isolation. Maybe some senior citizens felt that way because you couldn't see your grandkids for so long. I know some older priests felt that way in those first few months. I felt that way a little bit too at times in those first months when the church was shut down. Like, I'm irrelevant. I'm not needed anymore by anybody. And that is a terrible feeling to have. And on top of that, there's so much, uncertainty about the long-term effects of this global pandemic, the effects on children, the effects on those who suffer from COVID, the long-term health, the possibility of some kind of PTSD, or people who have struggled with anxiety and depression. and continue to struggle. Those who are immunocompromised, who maybe understandably fear going out to this very day. And then there are those simply who are doubting and questioning God and faith. Where is God? On top of all that, there's racial strife. There's political strife. There's the threat of war. Where is God? Has He abandoned us? What is He doing in the world today? Well, to get into that question and to see it up close and personal, we're going to look at the story of Abraham. Because it turns out, Abraham, who the New Testament calls our father in faith, dealt with the same kind of idea God had abandoned him. You see in the course of his story, if you read it, a story that goes from doubt to faith and trust. Well, that's what we'll look at today. But to look at Abraham, you got to look at the whole context of creation. In the book of Genesis, what God is doing and plans to do with Abraham. So, the beginning, the book of Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth. He created Adam and Eve, our first parents. And in the garden, the beginning, Adam and Eve had an intimate relationship with God. But because of the fall, because of their disobedience, because they ate the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve lost that original intimacy. And as you probably know, go from bad to worse, because then immediately Cain slays, murders his brother Abel. Well, murder is introduced into the human story. And the children of Cain are so wicked that God sends the flood. And he calls Noah and the ark. You know what, though? You think about Noah's ark and that story, it didn't work. It didn't work. Do you ever ask yourself, why doesn't God just push the reset button on the human race and start over again? Well, the reason is, He tried that primordial history in Genesis. He tried it and it didn't work. The children of Noah are just as bad as before. So God tries another tactic. He goes to a plan that's much more radical. He calls this one guy to restore a right relationship with the human race and His great big plan. There's one thing very, very important at the very beginning of the story of Abraham, who's called Abram at the beginning. And a very important point about him and his wife Sarah. And what's that? Well, Genesis 11, verse 30 says this simply, "Now Sarah was barren. She had no child." So Abram's wife Sarah is barren. Infertility is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking if any of you have ever experienced it, if you know of anyone. It's such a terrible burden to bear that couples must bear and struggle with. But as hard as it might be today, much harder in ancient time, in ancient culture, in the nomadic culture 4,000 years ago that Abram and Sarah lived in. Well, why? Because our modern culture tends to think of our worth and our value and our legacy in terms of our own personal achievements, our own personal success, the mark we leave on the world. That's not at all how ancient cultures thought. In the time of Abraham, everything was about the next generation. Everything was about having a child. Your whole worth, your whole value, your whole legacy was tied up in having a son specifically. And if you didn't have a child, you were nothing. So Abram and Sarah in a foreign land in the east, they are wealthy, they're well off, but they have no ability to have a child. That's where God enters in with His great plan. And we hear in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 and 3, Abram's first encounter with God, calling God this, "Go forth from your land, your relatives, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. All the families of the earth will find blessing in you. So God encounters Abram, and he gives him a commandment, and he gives him a threefold promise. God makes three promises here. First, of a nation and land. And that will be fulfilled, the promise of nation and land, in his grandson Jacob's descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel, who are brought back to the promised land through the leadership of Moses. The second promise is of a great name. His name will be great, and that's a euphemism for a royal dynasty, a royal lineage. And that promise will be fulfilled in King David. King David, a far descendant of Abram, who will be a man after God's own heart, and God will promise him that his dynasty will never fail. The third promise to Abram here is worldwide blessing. All nations, all people will find blessing in you. Where is this fulfilled? It's fulfilled ultimately in Jesus Christ. Well, my point is, this threefold promise to Abram here is the whole story of the Bible. It's the whole story of the Bible. But does Abram care? Does this really mean anything to him? No. Abram doesn't know God. He has no interest yet in knowing God or believing in God or trusting in God. He has one interest, one desperate interest, and that is to have a son. And all these great promises, God's great plan for the human race, rests on Abram simply having a son. And this is the first just simple point I want to make. God meets us in our desires. You think about it, we want something from God, and our desires are often the place where God meets us. He will grant us what we want in order to lead us deeper, to lead us into a deeper relationship with Him of what He wants ultimately for us. And that's the beauty of our great God. So God is going to bless Abram and give him what he wants, his only concern, but he only sort of obeys. And this is very interesting, because the very next verse in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, we hear this. Abram went, and the Lord directed him, and Lot went with him. Well, Abram goes, but he takes his nephew Lot with him. So he only sort of obeyed. The beauty of the Bible is that you can read Bible stories over and over again and learn more and more of little subtleties. This is a little subtlety here, because basically Abram is hedging his bets. He has a contingency plan. He has a backup plan. Okay, God, I'll follow you. You give me the promise of a son. I'll make this move to the promised land. But I'm going to just, hedge my bets here and bring my nephew with you, just in case. And so Abram goes. And the story of him is really a story of going from not knowing God and caring about God to knowing God and growing in trust. That's the whole story. And God waits. God waits until he's ready to fully give his heart over to faith and trust. Well, that's where we pick up with the first reading we heard today, which is from Genesis chapter 15. We hear at the beginning of that chapter 15, verse 1, sometime afterward the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield. I will make your reward very great. So it's been many years, presumably. He's gone to the land of Canaan, but he's filled with fear. He's filled with fear maybe that after these decades or, many decades, God has forgotten him. God has abandoned him. And we can be the same way sometimes, can't we? Maybe we had a hope and a dream that we just waited and waited and waited, and we feel like we're stuck in fear. Fear that God's not going to fulfill his promises. Our hopes and dreams will not be met. So Abram's not too thrilled here. He then says this in Genesis 15, verse 2 and 3. But Abram said, Lord God, what can you give me if I die childless and have only a servant of my household, Eleazar of Damascus? Abram continued, Look, you have given me no offspring, so a servant of my household will be my heir. So Abram's pointing out here, God, you haven't done your part of the bargain. You haven't delivered. You ever been there? You're angry. You're upset. You feel that, God has given you and led you on to a certain dream, a certain hope, and it's not there yet. It could be the promise of a child, the promise of a job, the promise of a blessing in some endeavor you're going to take up. He hasn't come through. Oh, this is a tough place, maybe that many people in the last 2 years in COVID have been. A place of doubt, a place of testing. You know what? Be like Abram. Speak up to God. Tell him how you feel, because he can take it. God is not going to strike you down or criticize you, and he doesn't criticize Abram either. Instead, he gives him a sign. And this is what we hear today in verse 4 and 5. Then the word of the Lord came to him, no, that one will not be your heir. Your own offspring will be your heir. The Lord God took Abram outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if you can. Just so, he added, shall your descendants be. So God takes Abram outside here. Here's another great subtlety that I bet you've never picked up before hearing this story. It's actually daytime. It's daytime when he takes him outside. We know that from a few verses later. So in other words, if you go out into a clear field at night, there's no city lights around, and you can see amazing amount of stars, countless stars. Imagine being in the desert where Abram was. Now God is taking him outside in the daytime. He can't see the stars, but he knows they're there. In the same way, God is saying, you don't see your descendants. You can know that I'm going to come through with my promises. So this is the pivotal moment for Abraham. This is the moment where finally, he takes that step of faith and trust. And this is the defining verse that Genesis tells us about him. Verse 6, Abram put his faith in the Lord, who credited it to him as an act of righteousness. Abram put his faith in God, and that put him in a right relationship with God. Simply making an act, a declaration of faith, is valuable and powerful in our relationship with him. So my friend, when we doubt God, when we think he's abandoned us, if he's abandoned our world, we're tempted to think that when our hopes and dreams are not met, we're invited. We're invited to faith and trust. Like I said, there's a value to simply declaring, God, I trust you. I trust you. Oh, I've said in the last couple of weeks, if you're in the middle of a storm in your life, maybe a long, drawn-out storm, don't ask why, God. We might be tempted to just cry, why, God? Instead, here's another suggestion. What, God, are you doing? What, God, are you doing in my life? What are you doing in the world? And that question can be brought to prayer. It can be something that we ponder and pray over. Because this is what I truly believe, my friends, that God is doing something great in the world today. He's doing something amazing in this generation, in the church, in the world. He's raising up heroes like Abraham. He's raising up saints who will trust in him, who will follow him, who will go and make a difference in the world. So may we bring that to prayer this week. That's my invitation and challenge to you. Bottom line of this whole message series is this. There's many, many times in life, in many different ways, where life just doesn't make sense. These times are opportunities. They're opportunities to have a faith that seeks understanding. Our faith should be a faith that seeks understanding. And my friends, if we seek God and keep on seeking him, eventually we're going to find him. Amen.